Okay, my friends, so far we've learned how to attach the store state to our component's props via the map state to props function, And we've read data from the states. But what if we want to change the store state? For example, we may want to delete one of these cards on this page. So how can we do that? All right. So first, we want a delete button, right, or something to delete that card. Then what we need to do is interact with this state from this component. So now if we go back to this diagram, we have our central state, and we've already passed our data via the props to this component using the map state to props function. All right. So now if we want to make a change to the store state, we have to dispatch an action from the component, and that action is going to contain a type. For example, a delete card or an edit card or whatever we're going to want it to be. And it's going to contain an optional payload. So in the case of deleting a card, the payload could be ID of the card that we want to delete. So then the action is dispatched to the reducer, and the reducer then takes that action and checks the type of action, and then it takes in the payload. Now in our case, the payload is going to be the ID of the card that we want to delete from the state. And the reducer makes that change to the central state. Then when the state changes, we get the updated state as a props inside the component. All right. So now we need to figure out a way to dispatch an action from the component right here. And that's actually pretty easy to do. So like before, when we did the map state to props, this time what we're going to do is create a function called map dispatch to props. And that's going to map our dispatches to our props so that we can call them from our component. Cool. All right. So let's create that function and see how we can do it. So I will say const map dispatch to props, and we call this function like this, and then this is going to be an arrow function, and this function takes a parameter, and this parameter is the dispatch method. Now remember when we worked in CodePen and we dispatched an action like this, we said store.dispatch and we passed in an action with a type and some additional payload. That's how we did it. But what we're going to do now is we are mapping dispatch to props. So we are going to be passing this function, which is in the store, into this map state to props function as a parameter. That means that inside here, we could just say dispatch and then the action inside of it. We don't need to actually say store.dispatch. So what we want to do in here is return an object, and this object is going to represent properties that we want to get as props inside of this component. Just like we did it here. So I want to map a function called delete card inside the component because we're going to delete a card inside this component. So what I wanted to do with the delete card function right here is dispatch an action. So it's going to be a function which will take a parameter, and that parameter is going to be the ID of the card that we want to delete. So it's an arrow function, and inside of here, let's do our function content. And what we're going to do is dispatch an action like so. And then the type of that action is going to be delete underscore card, and the additional payload that we want to send is the ID. So I'll create a property called ID and set that to equal the ID. And this ID is going to be the ID that we receive inside this function when we call it. Okay. And if the key and value are the same, we don't need to write both of them. So we can delete this one like so. And this will do the same thing as well. It's just an ES6 syntax. So now we're dispatching this action whenever we call this function. And this function is going to be attached to our props so that we can use it inside the component. But before we do that, we're going to need to take this and we need to pass it into the connect function down here, much like we did with the map state to props. So the map state to props function is always going to be the first, and then the map dispatch to props will be the second. All right, so now if we go up to the component over here, what I'm going to do is just console log out the props to show that function on the prop. So I will say console log and then this dot props. Okay, so save that and go back to the browser and check it. So let's open up the browser console, and now we see the props object right here. And we can see that delete card method right here, and it expects an ID. So this is the method that we'll be calling to delete a card from this card component. All right, so let's do that. And we'll go back to the card component. Now, first of all, we need some kind of button underneath here, right? So that when we click it, it's going to fire this function at some point. So let's create that underneath of this P tag. First of all, I'll do a button tag, and we'll give it a class name of UI primary right floated button. So this is a semantic UI CSS class that we added to the project when we created it. So inside of here, I'll just say delete. Now we want to attach a click event to this button. So let's say on click and set that equal to some function, which we'll define up here in a second. And that function is going to be called on button click, like so. All right, so let's create that on button click function. I will say on button click, and this is going to be an arrow function. And inside that function, we'd like to call this method right here because we want to delete this card. So we can just say this.props.delete card like so and call that function. But remember, we pass in the ID as an argument to this function. So it specs an ID right here. So we need to send the ID of this card. And now, if you look on the props on the card right here, we have an ID property. So let's get this ID inside of our helper function. So I will say let ID is equal to, and then we could just grab that ID by saying this props.card.id. Then we'll be passing the ID of that card into this function. Okay. So what we're doing is we're calling this function, which is firing this function right here inside the return statement. And inside that function, we are making a dispatch and sending this action to the root reducer. So let's save all that and then go to the route reducer because this is where we receive the action. So now let's just log this to the console, and I'll say console log and then the action. So whenever that action is dispatched, whenever we click on that delete button, then it's going to receive that action right here, and it's going to log it to the console. So let's save all that and see if it works. So I will click delete, and all right, so it's logging that to the console. Let's do it again. And yeah, see, there it goes. It logs it again. Now, every time we click the delete button, it's firing that function and dispatching the action to the root reducer and logging it to the developer console. All right, so that's all fine. But what we actually want to do is delete this card from the store state. So we'll pause right here, and then when we come back in the next video, we're going to figure that out. All right? So I'll see you then.